Okay, yeah, so with the 2000 film Traffic here today, it's another one that does not deal with specific historical events per se, but it does heavily deal with a specific issue that is still an issue to today and was kind of the big peak as far as being in the cultural zeitgeist was kind of the 1980s war on drugs with the big push with Nancy Reagan and all of that, and then the DARE program, and that's. Well, of course, I was also in grade school at that time, so but that feels like culturally when the war, quote unquote, war on drugs kind of started to accelerate, and it was a problem maybe we would talk about more up front.
I think it started with Nixon, though, right? And like this in the 70s, he was like the first person to start, doing like the schedules, different schedules of drugs and stuff.
True,
but for sure, it did get with the Nancy Reagan and DARE and everything in the 80s was definitely like the heyday of the war on drugs.
Right, because you could even go back further to when they were all outlawed in the first place.
Yeah, it's still a huge problem today. And I just want to be clear, I don't just mean drugs are a huge problem, I mean the war on drugs is a huge problem.
Right, and that's something that I feel like is even shifted since maybe even this movie came out 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And I think if you redo a movie Traffic today, there's a way different philosophical spin on it than there is in this 2000 film.
Yep.
So for those who aren't familiar with it, this is a very solid movie. I don't think it's a great movie, but it's very solid. It was the Best Picture nominee, and it does an interesting job of showing not just the war on drugs, but the world of drugs from essentially every level. So you have the addicts, the dealers. Mm-hmm. The Michael Douglas's character is hired to be the new drug czar in the United States, kind of in charge of leading it. You go to Mexico, where you see the people in the cartels, and Benicio Del Toro.
And Mexican cops, too.
Benicio Del Toro plays a Mexican cop, and he actually won Oscar for Best Supporting Actor here. And then you see a dealer in the United States who's kind of in charge of basically importing or smuggling the drugs in the United States. And so it's got all levels of people that are affected by this, and there's the three main storylines that they follow-ish. One is Michael Douglas, who is kind of learning about the war on drugs and his new role in the government, while also dealing with a daughter who is a drug user in high school. That's one storyline. One is Catherine Zeta-Jones as the wife of the big U.S. drug dealer bringing stuff into San Diego and La Jolla, and him getting arrested is kind of then one plot, and her dealing with that because she didn't know he was a dealer. And then Benicio Del Toro's storyline in Mexico, where he kind of at first busts some dealers and smugglers, and then gets kind of wrapped up in with this general who's going to get appointed as the new Mexican drug czar. But he's the kind of the secret is he's actually working with one of the cartels to try to push out another cartel. Right. And so three significant storylines. So it actually makes the runtime go by pretty quick because you're almost watching three movies. Mm-hmm. But it's also neat how the storylines will overlap and different characters show up in other characters' storylines in a way that doesn't feel too forced. And so it's really solid. I do like this movie a lot. And Don Cheadle, I thought, kind of stole the show. I don't know why. I think he's just kind of more interesting on screen than some of the other people here. And he just kind of stood out to me.
So this movie, and I don't know, it probably does. Is this movie related in any way to Crash?
It's a similar kind of feel as far as filmmaking goes, but it's different writers and directors.
Okay, right. So I think in Crash, because Don Cheadle is also, he's a cop in this movie. He's like a DEA agent, and then he's also a cop in Crash.
Okay, but yeah, different writer, different director. I mean, but as far as the flow of the story with the different narratives that kind of overlap, very similar, I would say.
Yeah, which I don't really. I think I like this movie better than Crash.
I would probably agree.
And I don't know, maybe it's just because I find Don Cheadle so charismatic, but he does kind of steal the show in that movie as well.
Yeah, I think he's kind of underused as an actor in general. I mean, yeah, he does. He works a lot, and everyone knows who he is. But I think he's just really, really good. Really pops on screen. Man, did we already kind of talk about everything? Like, I was kind of planning on getting into our own thoughts on this. So it's complicated, and kind of the realization that Michael Douglas's character does come to by the end doesn't quite match my sentiment, but he kind of is giving his speech as, the debut to the press with his new position in the government as drug czar, and then it actually walks out of the press conference basically saying, I can't do this. If there's a war on drugs, that means there's a war on the people who do drugs, which is our friends and family, and I don't see how you declare war on your family, which I think is kind of maybe a hokey way to see it, because I'm against the war on drugs for a different reason than that specific one, and so it's complicated, but let's go ahead and talk about the complicated, and maybe this might end up just being your and I's. How do you say that? Where do you put the apostrophe? Our opinion. This might just end up being our opinion.
Yeah, just say our.
Okay, well, but then opinion is singular and it should be plural. Our opinions. Yeah, there it is.
So our opinions.
Okay, I probably got to keep that in there. So I don't see why the United States has not seen it as being so similar to prohibition in the 1920s, where by outlawing something, you give all the power to the criminals. And the reason there are these drug lords and, these just rich criminals who are cutthroat and doing their own thing is because it's an illegal trade. So if you have it's basic economy.
Yeah. I watched a TED Talk by a guy, Dr. Ethan Nadelman, and he, in the middle of this TED Talk, he says, and this is a quote from him, I didn't come up with this, but he said, people tend to think of prohibition as the ultimate form of regulation, when in fact it represents the abdication of regulation with criminals filling the void.
Ah, perfect.
And
yeah.
I had never really, obviously you learn about alcohol prohibition and how that was a massive, massive failure. But for some reason, you're right, we don't see this as the same thing. And so when you have, with alcohol prohibition, they tried to make, consumption and sale of alcohol illegal, and it didn't work. And it was a huge failure. And it basically, not created, but way enhanced organized crime in the United States. And I don't see why the same thing hasn't happened with this. For some reason, this has gone on for almost 50 years, and it's still the same, the policies and the actions being taken by the state are the same, more or less, as they were 50 years ago.
The public sentiment is shifting, though, of course, and the idea of treating drug users as victims of addiction versus straight-up criminals. We're shifting better, but you're right. We're still a long ways away from what we kind of know we should be.
In the eyes of the public, for sure. But
legislation hasn't caught up with that.
Yeah, the legislation hasn't, and it's funny. In that same TED Talk, he talks about it used to be that like drug reform was the thing that no one could get behind. Everyone, it was basically a bipartisan, you had bipartisan support for cracking down more on drugs, especially when you talk about, like you said, back in the 80s, making harsher sentencing and mandatory minimums and stuff like that. But now it's almost the opposite. Like, maybe not necessarily politicians, but for sure, like, just your run-of-the-mill center left, your run-of-the-mill center right can all agree the war on drugs is bad, and legalization is probably the answer, at least for a lot of it.
Well, especially, so obviously our country has shifted significantly since this movie came out 20 years ago when it comes to marijuana. And most of the country, is it about 50-50 on medical marijuana being legal now?
Yeah, I think it's 50-50 roughly on medical marijuana being legal.
And then about 5 to 10 states have gone full on recreational as well?
Yep. And I think it's only a matter of time before marijuana is completely legal, like even federally.
Correct. There are a lot of places, even if they're not changing the legislation, they're doing the decriminalization, or where basically they don't crack down on it. So it's like, it's still technically illegal on paper, but we're going to stop seeking out the people who are doing it.
Yeah.
And again, I couldn't care less about, I don't even drink. I've never done drugs.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't see any reason or any evidence that shows that marijuana is not just not worse than alcohol, it's less of an issue than alcohol. Like, my understanding, and again, this is from information I've heard over several years, and I've never heard it contradicted, is that there are 0 reported marijuana overdose deaths ever, because you can't overdose on marijuana, versus people die of alcohol poisoning on a regular basis. And the line I always use is, people don't get high and beat their kids. I'm not saying there's not negative repercussions if you're stoned, and obviously you should not be, you still get a DUI and all those kinds of things. But if you're going to compare alcohol to marijuana, it's no contest. Alcohol is objectively a worse substance.
Right.
So prohibition kind of back in the 20s, though, the reason it didn't work is you're basically telling General Joe Schmo worker getting off from work at the factory or the office that he was a criminal by having a beer. And so the public just didn't accept it, which kept the demand high, which gave the criminals all the power. And marijuana's kind of slowly been the same thing, where it's kind of gone to, a hippie drug or whatever to the 60s. Or, of course, it's outlawed in the first place because it was associated with minority usage, and it was kind of a racist thing to make it illegal in the first place.
Well, that's kind of the case with just about all initial prohibition of drug laws.
True, but some of those are harsher than marijuana.
Right, but even, like way, way back in the day, I'm talking like 1800s,
right.
Turn of the century times, your main demographic of drug users is like middle-aged, middle-class white people, and even like Coca-Cola had legit cocaine in it until 1900. And it wasn't until those drug and their uses started to be associated with different minority groups. So like, Chinese railroad workers using opiates, or Southern African Americans using cocaine, or Mexican immigrants using marijuana. When the drug was associated with a minority group, that was when the prohibition laws started to get implemented.
Right. And then the sad stat today is that, so the two biggest lobbying groups against the legalization of marijuana are the pharmaceutical industry, who would rather you use their stuff than marijuana that's way cheaper, and the for-profit prison industry that wants to keep locking up those people for marijuana offenses. So if those are the two biggest reasons those laws aren't getting changed, that kind of tells you everything you need to know about the issue. And that doesn't even get to harder stuff than marijuana. But marijuana specifically, frankly, should be legal, regulated, and taxed. And you save so much money on every end. You bring in more revenue.
And even beyond marijuana, just in general, recreational drug legalization would solve so many problems. And there are concerns about increased use, and
which Colorado has not had.
No. I'm talking about just drugs across the board.
Correct. Okay, fair.
And I hear that. Like I can see how that's a concern. But when you look at the tax revenue you get from it, the fact that you reduce issues with adulterated drugs, so like people using heroin has
not clean
fentanyl or something in it, you can increase your tax revenue by taxing that, and then also decrease the amount of money that you're spending on this useless war on drugs. You can spend that money on other stuff, and it's
so obvious that it's infuriating.
Right, and the fact that you treat it like it's something different when it's exactly the same. It's no different than any other commodities market like alcohol, tobacco, coffee, sugar, all things that are objectively bad for you, and people use just and are addicted to, just like they would be addicted to any other drug. But all those things are legal, but for some reason the drugs is the thing that is being combated. And it's when you try to focus on the supply side of the equation of supply and demand without decreasing the demand, all that happens is the price goes up.
Right.
And drugs are not price sensitive. People will pay for drugs no matter what because they're addicted to them. You're only helping, the cartels.
There you go. That's a good way to put it. And yeah, so that's the reason too. We talk about the opioid problem in the United States right now is because people are getting addicted to prescription legal pain medication, and then in the absence of that, are filling that void with illegal substances. So yes, I understand the argument for, we don't want our kids to access these controlled substances. Absolutely. We don't want your kids taking legal prescription painkillers either, do you? So yes, we treat it like any controlled substance.
The problem is, though, is that you get prescribed an opiate, you get addicted to it, then the prescription runs out, or the doctor says, well, you don't need this anymore. But there's nowhere for you to go to get off of it. Basically, your only recourse is to go and try and find heroin.
Right. Whereas if you could have just smoked weed in the first place, or taken an edible and had a similar level of pain relief without the addiction,
or even something. And I know this is going to sound absolutely loco, crazy, insane to some people, but there are European countries, Switzerland is probably like the biggest, most well-known one, that their response to, a heroin use epidemic where people are overdosing, people are getting infections, people are getting HIV. Instead of, cracking down and making it a big deal criminally, they set up basically like heroin help centers. So people could go there, they could actually get free heroin, clean needles, use heroin under medical supervision, but at the same time, when they're in those places, they have access to social workers, they have access to counseling, they have access to people helping them find jobs and find housing.
And all that's cheaper than fighting the war on drugs.
Right, and that approach costs less money and also works because in Switzerland there was a drop in drug-related crime. 2/3 of the people that went to these places that were getting free heroin from the government ended up getting regular jobs and getting off, basically kicking the addiction. And today, 70% of heroin users in Switzerland end up seeking treatment for that addiction at these help centers.
Right. You're not losing people to Portugal. Similarly, has decriminalized drugs and basically treats it as a public health issue, not a criminal issue. And it's just a smarter way to handle the whole problem from every front. But we just don't have the political will, the education, and we're fighting the pharmaceutical industry.
And we've been fighting this war on drugs for so long. It's been 50 years that it's
a sunk loss thing or whatever. Yeah.
Well, that, but also, I mean, any politician who comes out at, who says part of their platform is that they are pro the government giving people free heroin, like they're going to get slaughtered in an election because
correct.
It's like, you give people free heroin. That's insane. That's crazy. Why would you do that? It's like, well, it's more than just giving people free heroin. Like that's not
right. And again, the people come back to the cost issue is like, we're already spending money. We're just going to spend it differently.
Yep. Yeah.
And it'll be less. We're going to spend less money differently and have a better outcome than the way you want to handle it currently. Yeah.
And there's also like a big kind of a hypocrisy aspect to it as well. Like when you look at seemingly the criminal justice system has no problem incarcerating people for possession or just sale, basically non-violent drug offenses. They have no problem locking people up for that. But then you look at like giant banks that are actively helping or at the very least, turning a blind eye to financial support for cartels.
Right.
Specifically, HSBC ignored billions of dollars coming from the Sinaloa cartel. And there's actually a story about how the cartels ended up making boxes that were the exact dimensions of the slots at the teller slots so that they could fill them up to, as full as they could go, so they could efficiently deposit as much money as possible. No one from HSBC, by the way, went to jail, and I think they got fined like $1.9 million or $1 billion, which sounds like a lot, but it's like just a few weeks of revenue for that bank. And then also Wachovia, the bank, accepted $420 billion from what the Justice Department described as suspicious Mexican sources without verifying the origin of any of that money. And again, no prosecutions. No one spent a day in jail for any of that.
Right, and which is doing more harm to society. If we're going to lock up people who do harm to society, is it a non-violent drug dealer, especially when we're talking about like specifically a pot dealer,
right,
versus a bank that's covering up for her cartel who's literally murdering people and putting a lot more product out on the streets and
right. But how much money does your local pot dealer have to lobby the government versus HSBC and Wachovia? So the war on drugs is a big issue, but it's also tied to a lot of other big issues, and they all kind of exacerbate each other.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And we've kind of strayed away from the movie itself. But again, the movie does deal with a lot of these themes. And the one line that comes to mind is when Miguel Ferrer's character, who's the guy Don Cheadle and his buddy arrest, basically says, what's the point of all this? Mm-hmm. You're sending me to prison or making this deal with me to change exactly what? Everybody who is getting high is going to keep getting high. All the drugs are going to keep getting in. This is completely pointless. Your whole career is pointless. And he's exactly right.
Yeah, he's not wrong. And that exact thing happened specifically with methamphetamines. So methamphetamines started to become an issue, and so the government started passing laws making it harder to get the chemicals used to make meth.
Oh, that's true. Right, like Sudafed and stuff.
So bigger producers of meth shut down, but that was like, throughout the 90s and like the early 2000s, you saw mobile meth labs became like, a relatively common thing, especially in like small town America, rural America. You have these little startups, I guess, basically little producers. They could, have their meth labs in a van or a camper or something. But then the government started to crack down on those and started to further restrict chemicals. And so what happened? Did people stop using meth? No. Did the supply of meth go down? No. What happened? Well, all of the meth production got pushed south of the border. So now cartels, in addition to growing and, smuggling, distributing, selling marijuana, they said, oh, well, we'll just start meth factories here. There are what are essentially factories that make meth. And so now it's a better deal for the cartels because you can charge more for a smaller amount. So like a truckload of marijuana doesn't get you as much money as a truckload of methamphetamines does. And by the way, it's cheaper and it's better meth.
Wow. Right. What a mess.
There's no stopping it. And another thing from that TED Talk the guy talked about was that, we have this desire, I guess, to try and rid our society of drugs when he's like, if you look at history, there's never been such thing as a drug-free society. Like every major society in all of history has had some sort of chemical or substance that they use to relieve stress or just have fun, or when you look at something like peyote or ayahuasca, it's viewed as like a spiritual experience, but there is no such thing as a drug-free society. At least there hasn't been in all of history. And even our society, I mean, heroin's illegal, but booze isn't, tobacco isn't, sugar isn't.
Right. And so you just want to make sure that people aren't abusing these substances to the point that they affect the rest of their life. But as far as trying to make everybody teetotalers for something, that it's just it's naive.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, so we haven't really talked about the movie itself too much. It was nominated for 5 Oscars and won 4 of them. So the only one it was nominated for and didn't win was Best Picture. Benicio Del Toro won Best Actor. Steven Soderbergh won Best Director, beating out Ridley Scott for Gladiator. And then it won Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Film Editing. So very, very successful, and it was 93% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah, that seems fair.
It's now at the same time though too, I almost found like the color schemes he uses for the different storylines, I almost thought was distracting. Like I get what he was going for, but it was almost like, and actually though his depiction of like the Mexico storyline being that 70s looking yellow hue has almost become a joke at this point, that like that's how Americans see Mexico, is with a yellow hue,
right? Yeah,
and then how blue the Michael Douglas storyline was kind of weird. It just like, it's like, is that intended? Is that my TV? Like, you wanted it that blue? So
yeah,
I get what he was going for, and it just kind of helped us keep the storyline straight, but it was almost made a little too much, I thought.
Yeah, especially because then it kind of becomes confusing when so then there's scenes between like Catherine Zeta-Jones and like Don Cheadle's like, well, what color correction are you supposed to use for that one? When the storylines are actually interacting. Right,
true. And Soderbergh himself has always been a very interesting director. He kind of started off in the independent scene. His breakout film was Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which is a super small independent film from 89. But then he also went on to do Aaron Brockovich, the Oceans movies, Ocean 11, Ocean's 12. He's that guy. Also did Logan Lucky more recently. So he's an A-list director who's kind of always been good, though, doing projects that he wants to do. So he's not taking the paycheck to do a Marvel movie. He'd rather do just kind of these smaller movies that kind of interest him creatively. Of course, then he's also the Magic Mike guy. It's kind of interesting to see his resume here. So very well-respected director who lots of people like to work with. And he's definitely worked with, some people over and over again. So
one other thing, and this actually relates more to the movie itself, in the first scene where we see Michael Douglas, It's before gets his job as a czar. He's a federal judge,
Right.
and he is presiding over a civil forfeiture case. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about what civil asset forfeiture is. It does relate to more than just drugs, but the seizing of assets related to drug-related crimes is like where that's like most of the seizures. So basically, what civil asset forfeiture is the government, right? The police can seize property without actually convicting or even charging you with a crime, because it's not a criminal case. It's not a criminal case against you. It is a civil case against your property. So it's literally the government is bringing a case against your house or against your car or against a sum of money. That is, either were the proceeds of crime or are helping you facilitate a crime.
Which can seem to make sense initially if you're using your house as a meth lab.
Right. It sounds good, and there are definitely positives that come from it. So, it is a way for the government to financially damage criminal enterprises. They use a lot of the seized funds or proceeds from the seized funds for like victim reparations. But where it gets bad is, number one, agencies a lot of the time are allowed to keep most or all of the proceeds from the stuff that they seize. So like, a police department can seize your car or your house and then sell it. And instead of like giving the money to victims of crime, they can just use it to go buy stuff, literally whatever they want. There's basically no limitations on how agencies can spend that money. So there are cases of people getting money seized from them, and the evidence that the government uses for why they need to seize the money is because you had a large sum of money, and normal people don't carry large sums of money. Therefore, that money's ours now.
Right. Oh, you're driving through Tennessee with $10,000 cash in your car? You must be a drug dealer going to buy a lot of drugs, so we're going to just take that money. That's happened a lot.
Yes.
And they're just now starting to shift the laws away from that.
There's stories of people driving with cash to like go buy a car or buy whatever. And so they have a large sum of money, they get pulled over, the cops find it, and they seize it, and that's that.
There's nothing you can do about it. You don't get it back. It's not yours anymore. Yep.
Right. And it sucks more for for people that don't have a lot of money, because it's expensive to get a lawyer to fight the government to get your property back. So,
right.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that up and talk about because in the movie, it's a guy gets his farm seized because there was marijuana being grown on the farm. So the government seized the entire farm in a civil asset forfeiture. And that's like, it doesn't even have to be the property of the person that was committing the crime. Like there's a story of a kid who was selling meth out of his parents' house, but he got arrested. The parents weren't charged with anything, but they lost their house because the government said that their house was being used to facilitate the selling of meth, so they seized the house.
Right, because the house is now guilty. Right.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to ancillary effects that we've kind of talked about before, where just because you have this thing that seems fine on its face, but then leads to this, and that can be corrupted in such a way that, well, that's not what was intended at all, but it is still the law.
Right.
And then it takes forever to get the political will to step up and change that. And I think you're just now hearing people kind of start to challenge these civil forfeiture laws so that basically people driving through certain states aren't just literally getting robbed by the police, because that's what's been happening.
Right. And the other thing, too, is that because it's a civil case, the burden of proof is not as high. So in a criminal case, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime. In civil forfeiture, you only have to prove
it was possible, basically,
with what's called a preponderance of the evidence, which basically means like you're 51% sure that just barely sure that it is more likely that this is being used for crime than not used for crime.
Right, and who's making that decision? Like the cops that took your money get to say, yeah, we think it was probably so. We get
in the end, it's a judge or a jury, whoever is deciding the civil case. But the burden of proof is not as high as a criminal case.
Right, and you could be telling that judge the truth, but if they think they're lying just because they're a skeptical person, they keep your money.
And it's like flipped as far as a criminal case, because in a criminal case you have the presumption of innocence, whereas in a civil forfeiture case you have to prove that your property was not being used in the commission of a crime.
Right.
Because you already lost it. Like it's already gone. The government already has it.
Right.
You have to prove that your property, or your money or whatever is innocent, instead of, the government proving that it was used in some sort of crime.
Right. And
is essentially how it works.
Yeah, I just don't see how those laws are constitutional at all. But here we are, because again, there's not enough. It's such a small issue, relatively speaking, that there's just not a political will to get it shifted back to the way that would be more just.
And the only thing you have to do to fight against it politically is to just show examples of how civil asset forfeiture has, like, well, if we didn't have that civil asset forfeiture, we couldn't have paid these victims' families for the, horrible crimes that were committed against them, or we couldn't have, wouldn't have been able to shut down this, this gang's drug operation, because those civil asset forfeiture laws is what allowed us to do that.
Right. We couldn't pin it on any one person, so we had to take the building. Right.
Right. So then it becomes, do you want to run on a platform that is, I guess,
exactly. There's no political will for it.
Should have a light shown on it that is anti-crime.
Right. Or the fact that, like, well, those guys are obviously drug dealers, so we need to take that money. Yeah, but they weren't committing a crime at the time, and it's not illegal to have money on you. So, yep, we have to let them go. But currently the laws are saying, nope, you can take that money. And kind of ties to the whole, I don't even know who said it back in the day, but the idea that it's better to let 9 guilty people go free than to put 1 innocent person in prison. And so it's kind of the same kind of thing with this.
Yeah, this is kind of a criminal justice thing overall, but the American criminal justice system was not designed to punish or catch guilty people. It was designed to keep innocent people out of jail.
Interesting, but it fails at that.
Right, but I'm saying, like, that a lot of people, when they think criminal justice, think, the purpose of that is to catch bad guys and punish the bad people. Right. When in reality, yes, that is part of it, but it's the main point of it is to keep innocent people out. That's why you have the right to an attorney. That's why that you have the Fifth Amendment and the Fourth Amendment.
Which is fascinating that we've just twisted it to where it kind of does go the opposite, and we convict innocent people on a regular basis still.
Right, because it's easy to make people angry and scared and get them to vote for you if you say that you're going to get in there and pass and support laws that are going to make all the bad people go away, than if you say, well, my stance is that I want to keep the innocent people out. I want to make sure that people are getting a fair shake and that people have rights. So
that doesn't sound as safe to me personally and my family. Right. Not realizing that you could end up being a victim of that system.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay, so next week we get to a pivotal event in the United States that did have an impact on world history that ripples to this day, and we will get to the events of 9/11 with the film United 93.